B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, March 18th, 2019. My dear old dad would have been 96 today. And I'm ever grateful to my father, Tom, who gave me so much in life. Taught me how to debate and argue. And those skills have served me well all these years. We've got great news to lead the podcast with today. And it is such a nice change because often it's not so good what we have to bring you. Late on Friday, the formerly uber-liberal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals based here in San Francisco ruled against the Trump administration and TransCanada. They ruled in favor of the scrappy plaintiffs, who I'll describe for you in a moment, who brought suit to block construction of the KeystoneXL pipeline. We told you that last November, Federal District Judge Brian Morris ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, and he issued an injunction blocking any further planning or construction of the pipeline. And on Friday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected a motion by TransCanada to put a stay on that injunction. So the injunction stands, construction may not proceed, and the only relief available now is from the United States Supreme Court. And let me tell you about the plaintiffs here. If you're a regular listener, you heard my podcast, which was the audio from a TV interview program that I do here locally in Marin County, featuring Super Attorney Stephen Volker and his client Frank Egger. And I got to tell you about Frank. He's in his 70s. His career was driving a bread delivery truck. But in addition to that, he was always very involved in local politics here in Marin County, and he helped found the North Coast Rivers Alliance. And they were one of the lead plaintiffs in this case. And I don't denigrate the Sierra Club, Earth Justice, Greenpeace, the Natural Resources Defense Fund, or anybody else who might have brought this suit. But I celebrate Egger and Volker and their persistence and determination to block that KeystoneXL pipeline. And here is a statement from Volker. We're pleased that the Ninth Circuit has upheld Judge Morris's rulings overturning the Trump administration's approval and TransCanada's construction of this reckless and risky project. All Americans should join the Ninth Circuit in rejecting TransCanada's deeply troubling claim that the Trump administration is above the law. The court correctly rejected the Trump administration's false claim that the pipeline would not worsen global warming, found the Trump administration had failed to adequately address this project's impacts on Native American cultural resources, greenhouse gas emissions, and the hundreds of rivers and groundwater basins that it threatens to harm with oil spills. Because Trump has turned his back on the Native American community and protection of our clean water and endangered fish and wildlife and refuses to admit global warming threatens all life, we ask the federal courts to order him to stop violating our nation's environmental laws. Now, I'm sure this will be appealed, and probably next term, next year, we can imagine that the Supreme Court will take up this case. And with Neil Gorsuch, his mother ran the EPA during the Reagan administration, we can expect a very interesting and fierce debate at the court, and we'll see how it turns out. Now, a ruling that is not nearly as significant was issued by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, upholding the right of an American to express him or herself by extending the middle digit, flipping the bird, F-U. And this is a fascinating case because a woman named Deborah Cruz Gullius got pulled over for speeding. The officer gave her a lesser offense ticket, a non-moving violation. Still, she was miffed, and as she drove away, apparently ungrateful for his consideration, she flipped the bird to him. And that did not make the cop happy, so he pulled her over again. And this was the critical point, because the second traffic stop was based on the fact that she had flipped him off. The judges found the first stop was justified because she'd committed an infraction, but any authority to seize her in connection with that infraction ended when the first stop concluded, meaning that the second one was not justified. That feels good, doesn't it? We still have a little bit of freedom left. Use it or lose it. So on Friday, Beto O'Rourke in Keokuk, Iowa, launched his campaign for president, rebounding from his loss to Ted Cruz in Texas. And he outpaced Bernie Sanders by a couple of $100,000 in the fundraising sweepstakes in the first 24 hours. Sanders had raked in $5.9 million, and O'Rourke brought in $6.1 million. And of course, I'm a little queasy about using money as any kind of a measure or a yardstick in political campaigns, but it is very commonly used, and I have to yield to that as one of the barometers of whether a candidate is viable or not. And today I'm releasing the audio from another local television interview on Marin TV with our congressman, Democrat Jared Huffman. And among other topics, he's now the chair of a subcommittee. He's on the select committee for climate change. Jared's a former environmental lawyer. I've known him since even before he ran for the state assembly here, where he did 6 years before he was elected to Congress. In our discussion, we talk about the Green New Deal. We have a little back and forth about the Democratic National Committee and how the superdelegates blocked an open convention in 2016, and the congressman doesn't like my math. You'll hear him describe that. We also talk about impeachment, and Mr. Huffman, who has co-sponsored resolutions for impeachment and voted for them, said he would impeach Trump in 30 seconds, but Nancy Pelosi is probably right politically. In fact, I found his answer was kind of all over the place, similar to his comments on Venezuela. And I invite your reaction to his remarks. I consider Jared Huffman to be quite smart and capable. He is a political guy who understands now how the system works. We talk about, in fact, he made a little news that the reason California's high-speed rail project designated the first phase for construction in the Central Valley between Merced and Bakersfield was in order to win one vote for Obamacare. Jim Costa, who's a conservative Democrat from the Agriculture Valley, he traded the commitment from the state of California to build the high-speed rail in his district in exchange for his vote on the Affordable Care Act. But some of those fascinating comments that I extracted from Mr. Huffman relate to his friendship with Beto O'Rourke. And in fact, Jared Huffman and Beto O'Rourke shared, I think with one or two other people, an apartment in Washington over the last 3 years. And Huffman is certainly sold on Beto, believes in his political skills, and I am impressed with his political skills. And I want to be clear that that's not a direct endorsement from me. Just because somebody is politically skillful doesn't mean I support their policies. And we'll get to that in a moment. But first, here's an excerpt from my conversation with Congressman Huffman about his friend Beto O'Rourke.
Well, it's helpful if you can actually talk to different constituencies. And one of the things that I think distinguished his Senate campaign is he started showing up in all of these remote parts of Texas where they, first of all, they'd never seen their U.S. Senator, even Ted Cruz, but they certainly hadn't seen a Democrat in a long, long time. And there's a power to showing up and respecting people enough to go to their place, to have a conversation with them, to have that in a civil way. Even if they disagree with you, sometimes they'll something changes. I honestly think that thing that changes in those kind of conversations, I think our country needs it. So I think Beto has a lot to offer in this campaign.
Now, one of the unorthodox elements here is that he lost by 200,000 votes. It wasn't, real close. And typically, we haven't seen people come off a losing election and run for a higher office. Did he wrestle with that?
Oh,
after
he definitely
the November
did.
Loss?
No, it was a tough loss. He had a huge amount of momentum going into Election Day in 2018, and I think on that election night, he thought he was going to win. Because, you and your viewers remember the kind of electricity there was around the Senate campaign. And he came closer than any Democrat has come in a statewide race in a long time. He did things that were remarkable in this race, but they came up just short. I think less than 2.5 percentage points, but they came up short. And that was tough. So Beto, famously went into a funk. He did a lot of reflection, a lot of soul searching. I got to be part of some of that because for 2 more months after he lost, I remained his roommate, and we spent a lot of time and had a few drinks together, and I had a chance to travel with him on part of that journey. It continued through the first couple months of this year. And I think now that he's in the presidential race, I feel like he got there in the right way. This is not something he had to do. But I think through a process of honest reflection and introspection, he decided that it made sense for him and his family and for the country.
That's California Congressman Jared Huffman. He's my congressman here all the way up the north coast of California. And you can hear the full interview. I'm releasing it today to subscribers at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. We cover a lot of ground in the interview, and I think you'll find it interesting. Maybe a few things won't play in Peoria because we talk about some local issues here and use some California code here and there, but I think that most people will find it interesting and accessible. Now, here's one of the positions where I don't agree with Beto O'Rourke. He was asked in Iowa on Friday night, do you support Medicare for all? Do you support single payer? And he responded in a way that recently killed the prospects of Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, who was testing the waters in Iowa. Asked if his goal is to get to a single-payer system, he said, no, my goal is to get to guaranteed, high-quality, universal health care for all, and I think there are many ways to get there. In response to a separate question, he said he is no longer sure that Medicare for all or a single-payer system would be the fastest way for us to get there. Then he said he's very open to listening to others as he decides on what the best way is to achieve the goal. And over the past 2 years, he's been hard to pin down on health care. In 2017, in June, as he launched his Senate campaign, he said on Facebook, a single-payer Medicare for all program is the best way to ensure all Americans get the health care they need. But he didn't sign on to a Medicare for all bill in the House, saying that he disagreed with some of the plan's specifics. And the Medicare for all plan, which would eliminate the private insurance companies and reduce costs dramatically, of course, is opposed by centrist Democrats who get a lot of money from health insurance donors and by most Republicans. And here Beto adopted a GOP talking point. Over time, I hope Medicare has the investment and buy-in necessary that people choose to leave employer-based insurance instead of being forced to. And this is one of the phony objections to Medicare for all. People say, oh, but I won't be able to get my Aetna coverage. Well, if everyone is covered by Medicare, you don't need private insurance coverage. Bernie Sanders has said if you want to buy up additional coverage for cosmetic surgery or things that may not be covered by Medicare, you're welcome to do that. But the health insurance industry will shrink or almost disappear. And that is only a problem for people who are invested in the highly profitable and grossly burdensome for-profit health insurance industry in this country. And here's today's New York Times with a really biased report. Medicare for all is divisive in the Democratic Party, reads the headline. And we have a quote in the early stage of the article from Washington State Democrat Kim Schreier, a pediatrician, who's saying that, and I believe it's a female, that she doesn't support a single payer because we have very practical solutions that we can implement immediately. We don't have the luxury of time right now to wait for a full overhaul of our health care system. Well, look, anything Democrats propose and gets passed in the House is likely going nowhere in the Senate until after 2020. And so for the presidential candidates to be focused on the future and how to fix our long-broken health care system, I think is highly appropriate. So then we get to the biased portion of this New York's Times piece. This really bothered me. All right. So first they quote Speaker Pelosi saying that last November, health care was on the ballot and health care won. Democrats ran on protecting pre-existing conditions coverage and trying to lower the cost of prescription drugs without offering any details. That was it. And Obamacare, in my view, is fatally flawed because it props up the pharmaceutical and health insurance industries. So following that quote from Pelosi, there is a statement here that is not in quotes, that is not attributed to anyone. It is in the faceless voice of the gray lady, the New York Times. Ms. Pelosi cannot afford to put moderate freshmen in Trump-friendly districts on the spot by putting Medicare for all up to a vote. That, my friends, is bullshit. Because poll after poll shows that even in red and purple districts, Medicare for all, with some, caveats, is supported by a majority of registered voters. The caveats are that when you tell people that their taxes may go up to pay for it, and you don't mention that they don't have to pay for health insurance anymore, they oppose the tax increases. Ignoring that, of course, not having to pay health insurance premiums of up to a couple of $1,000s a month per person is quite a burden. So that's where we stand on those issues today. In New Zealand, they are still investigating the background and some of the recent history of the alleged shooter at 2 mosques, killing 50 people and wounding as many. Brenton Tarrant is the 28-year-old Australian man who is the suspect. He appears to have traveled extensively throughout Europe, the Middle East, Asia. He went to Turkey, France, Pakistan, Bulgaria, Hungary, and North Korea. And in his so-called manifesto that he put online just before he began his shooting spree, he claimed that it was while traveling through Western Europe in 2017 that his views on immigration dramatically changed. He was radicalized by the report of an 11-year-old girl in Stockholm who was killed when an Uzbek man rammed his truck into a group of pedestrians in Stockholm. Now, these, of course, are not rational connections. To shoot up a mosque in New Zealand because of something an Uzbek man did 2 years ago, well, we cannot call that rational. He also said that while he thinks Trump politically is kind of an idiot, I'm paraphrasing, that he does credit Trump for opening up the vein of hate and white nationalism that appears to afflict Mr. Tarrant. In New Zealand, the response from the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is getting some pretty high marks. And she is coupling it with a plan to introduce new legislation to reform gun laws in New Zealand within 10 days. That is astounding. Now, I guess there is no NZRA, New Zealand Rifle Association. There is gun ownership there, a couple of million guns in a country of 4.6 million people. But the Prime Minister has also ordered an inquiry into whether government agencies could have prevented the attack. Now, there is a vibrant spy and intelligence community operating in New Zealand. We know that. And I've linked to a very powerful piece published at Consortium News today. The link is in the show file for this podcast at peterbcollins.com. And Susie Dawson, who is now self-exiled in Russia because of the harassment she received in New Zealand, writes a very strong piece. And she quotes some of the people, like the Prime Minister, saying, "Did we miss something? Did our intelligence people fail to get the signals that this man was sending?" And so Susie notes that she and Kim.com, who opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, who are founders of the Internet Party of New Zealand, they were spied on. And Dawson protests, "I was spied on for my independent journalism, my legal pro-democratic activism, despite having no history of violence, no access to weapons, no weapons training, and no extremist ideological beliefs." But this guy Tarrant did not get the kind of scrutiny that was applied to Susie Dawson, Kim.com, and others. So check it out. I think it's a very powerful piece and worth a read over at consortiumnews.com. And as if to remind us, despite Trump waving off, he said, maybe there's some nuts out there who follow what I say, but he's claiming he's not responsible for incident after incident that is driven by a hateful individual with some connection to Donald Trump or his messages. Do you remember Cesar Sayoc? Now, we've all but forgotten about this guy. He's the one who lived in his van in Florida, and the van had all of these pro-Trump stickers on it. He's the guy who made crude pipe bombs and mailed them to about a dozen Democrats and the actor Robert De Niro, as well as a couple that were aimed at CNN. And these were clearly carrying out a mission that Cesar Sayoc thought Donald Trump would approve of. He was a deranged MAGA man. And Trump's indifference to the negative impact that his tweets, his racist comments, his justifications of neo-Nazis is really a blight on our nation today. Sayoc, by the way, scheduled for a plea arraignment in a New York courtroom on Thursday, where he is expected to plead guilty. Therefore, we won't see a trial, and we'll never get the full details on what Cesar Sayoc was up to. Also, I just want to briefly note that in Utrecht in the Netherlands today, a gunman opened fire on a train. 3 people were killed, 5 were injured, and after a manhunt, they arrested a Turkish-born individual who is their suspect. And while it was initially treated as a terrorism act, they now say the shooting stemmed from a family dispute. We'll see if more investigation helps us get a better handle on that. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And over the weekend, quite a few people renewed their annual subscriptions. I want to thank Ford Green and Chris Stubblefield and Teresa Paris. Terry, how many subscriptions do you have? I'm going to have to investigate that. They're so generous, and I really appreciate that. It's what keeps me going. It's not only validation, but it helps cover the costs of operating the podcast and the servers and all that stuff. So I invite you to become a subscriber, too. All you got to do is hit peterbcollins.com, then hit the menu tab, then hit Become a Subscriber. Then you're on the sign-up page, and you can hit it again by choosing $5, $10, $20 a month. I've got bonus gifts for you if you take out a new annual subscription in the continental U.S., and currently, we're featuring Dr. Justin A. Frank's psychoanalytic approach to Donald Trump. It's called Trump on the Couch. And in the book and in our podcast interview with Dr. Frank, he talked about how Trump, when he was sent away to military boarding school by his father, developed some of his bully and thuggish tactics. And tomorrow, there is a thug summit at the White House in Washington, because Jair Bolsonaro, the new strongman from Brazil, is coming to visit and hug a thug and get recharged with extra hate and that sense of fear and power that propels people like Trump and Bolsonaro. And I highly recommend Glenn Greenwald, who is based in Rio de Janeiro, his report on the first 90 days of Bolsonaro's term, where his older son has been linked directly to paramilitary gangs and paramilitary police operatives, including 2 of them who have just been arrested for the 2018 assassination of Rio de Janeiro City Councilor Marielle Franco. And this is a detailed article. I am not going to quote everything from it for you because I do want you to read it. But it shows how Flavio Bolsonaro, who is Jair's oldest son, has put the mother and wife of one of the suspects in this killing, one of Brazil's most notorious gangsters. Those people are on the payroll of the nation of Brazil. Flavio himself moved up to the federal Senate after he won his election on the coattails of his father. And in February, his ties to militias became even more glaring. Checks were found issued in the name of his campaign account, signed by the sister of 2 twin brother militia members, Alan and Alex Rodriguez de Oliveira. And just months prior to the arrest of those 2 brothers, Flavio posted to his Instagram a photo of himself and his father at a birthday party for the 2 armed thugs. So there's more in the piece. I think you get the flavor of it. And what we are seeing is a thug summit in Washington tomorrow. Several dozen civil liberties groups are pressing the House Judiciary Committee to hold hearings before the December expiration of the so-called USA Freedom Act. This is the legislation that permits the NSA to demand your phone records from your phone company. And we are told that the program has been quietly kind of dismantled, or it's been unused for many months. That leaked from a Republican intelligence advisor to a member of Congress a couple of weeks ago. So I applaud this effort. I would love to see the USA Freedom Act expire and not be renewed. But we do have to be skeptical here because the information is unconfirmed that the metadata program stopped last year. And Nafiz Ahmed, who is a talented reporter based in Britain, suggested in a recent article that the NSA probably found another way to get the same information without having to contact the phone companies to get your phone records. Democrats in the House and Senate are asking the FBI to open investigations into the activities of Cindy Yang, also known as either Li Yang or Yang Li. It's not here in front of me. She's the woman connected to massage parlors and nail polish salons in South Florida who bought access to Mar-a-Lago, got pictures with Trump and top Republican operatives. Then she put them on a website and offered to sell access to the Trump administration to wealthy and powerful Chinese individuals. And the massage parlor bust of the Patriots owner, Robert Kraft, is what has opened this can of worms. And so we'll see if there is an investigation and where it leads. According to Britain-based The Guardian, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman appears to have lost some power in recent moves by his aging father, King Salman. And it appears that the Crown Prince, MBS, is sulking, because there are reports over the last 2 weeks that he has failed to attend key cabinet meetings, including the one where Daddy transferred the power of investments by the kingdom and by its sovereign wealth fund to an elderly advisor, the king, Musaed al-Iban, who was educated at Harvard and named as National Security Advisor, too. And we're told that MBS did not attend to the most recent weekly meetings, which are required by the king. So we'll see if this actually pans out and if changes are afoot. Another Guardian story that linked the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to blocking moves at an environment assembly held by the United Nations in Nairobi, Kenya, last week. And this relates to geoengineering. And I want to pause for a moment to acknowledge that I have many listeners who have pleaded with me to cover geoengineering, the chemtrails that they claim pollute our skies in an effort to control the weather. And I am still very open-minded about this. And this hearing, this conference, where geoengineering moves that apparently were seen as positives by many of the attendees, but they want to have strict rules and oversight of experiments that they hope might help reduce the impact of global warming by seeding the oceans and injecting particulates into the atmosphere. Now, this article treats these scientific projects or experiments as things that are really just in the testing phase. And, to date, I can find no concrete evidence of the geoengineering programs that are widely reported on YouTube videos and on some fringe websites. And quoting from the Guardian article here, once dismissed as reckless science fiction, geoengineering has risen up the political agenda of some nations as the climate crisis has become more apparent. The petrochemical industry sees it as a way to justify further expansion of fossil fuel industries. Chevron, BP, and other high-emitting companies have invested in firms that are pushing ahead with experiments to pull CO2 out of the air. I'm still quoting, U.S. academics at Harvard are also poised to conduct the biggest outdoor test of stratospheric aerosol injection. That's chemtrails, which simulates the cloaking effect of a volcano eruption. The researchers say this test, known as SCOPEX, will probably take place in New Mexico. So, I remain skeptical of the denials by our government. I think that it's more likely than not that there is a chemtrails program. There is a geoengineering program funded by our government. I simply haven't been able to find evidence or credible witnesses to support that. So I'll keep looking, and this is kind of a fascinating moment where that surfaced in a corporate media outlet. Two more items today. Trump has put members of his wrecking crew into the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they are now moving to roll back safety inspections and other requirements because, it's such a safe industry and they're struggling with expenses. They need to cut costs, so safety inspections are the place to go. And just how absurd is this? Because if our electric utilities are under financial pressure, allowing them to cut costs by reducing safety inspections and other measures is a recipe for total disaster. Because you're authorizing them under a self-regulation mantra, that works so well on Wall Street, to just handle it all themselves. And that will lead to the next Chernobyl or the next Fukushima. And finally, I want to thank the Center for Constitutional Rights for alerting us. You heard recently that the border folks on the southern border were maintaining files on journalists and monitoring them. Well, it wasn't just journalists. CCR says clients at Al Otro Lado, that is a group that provides legal services and training to immigrants. Suddenly, the lawyers were being detained and questioned for hours, having alerts placed on their U.S. passports, getting travel documents revoked without explanation. One lawyer was detained with her 7-year-old daughter in a cell with no food or water for more than 8 hours. These are Americans, It was clear that the harassment was in retaliation for the legal work helping people seeking asylum and CCR's lawsuit around it. So they're now joining forces with the journalists who have been surveilled, and we'll see where that leads. And finally today, I like to let you know that I ask a lot of different people for interviews. And some of them work out, and you hear them in a podcast interview right here. And I don't usually tell you about the ones that got away. But I recently decided I wanted to interview Caitlin Johnston. She's this fiery Australian writer who covers American politics with more depth and knowledge than many American journalists do. And so I reached out to our mutual friend Joe Laria. He's the editor at consortiumnews.com. And I said, "Hey, Joe, I'd like to interview Katie. Could you introduce us?" And today he responded, "Peter, I asked Katie, and she told me that she does not do any interviews. She said interviews put too much wobble on my thing." It really cracked me up. The most original turn down of an interview request your humble host has ever received, and I love it. Katie, I don't want to put any wobble on your thing, okay? You keep writing, I'll keep reading. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.